So the question that we're after in this paper is, for whom has persistent and temporary earnings risk changed over time, and why? So for those of you who are not knee deep in this literature, persistent risk is the type of income shock where you see this propagate forward, change your future path of earnings potential, versus temporary risk, which is something that comes and goes. We're then going to partition the data into very fine intervals. We're going to look at occupation, we're going to look at gender, we're going to look at race, we're going to look at all sorts of characteristics of individuals and ask, well, in which of these groups have we seen income risk going up and why? So what we find is that since the 1980s, persistent earnings risk has risen by about 10%, which is, and we're going to show later in the paper, results in a large welfare loss for the typical US household. And the scarring of the unemployed has worsened. So when you lose your job, your earnings drifts downwards almost 50% faster. So you can think of the job ladders getting taller, and when you fall off, it hurts more. So why is earnings risk changing? What this method allows us to do is really dig into and assess a number of theories for rising persistent earnings risk. What we're going to do is find that this is primarily a high-skill phenomenon. College-educated workers are going to face the largest increase in risk. And contrary to many existing narratives out there in the press and in the academic literature, this is not a phenomenon that's being driven by, let's say, low-skilled men or construction workers, and potentially not being driven by Rust Belt-related hypotheses. We're going to find that workers in non-routine, cognitive, and computer-intensive occupations have faced the largest increase in permanent earnings risk. It's unrelated to the routine content, and we're going to have some evidence that tells us that it doesn't have to do with Rust Belt-related stories. This isn't a story about the decline in manufacturing or decline in unionization rates. But it's not to say that high-skill workers, let's say, overall are worse off over the last 40 years. What we're not mentioning here in this paper is the first moment, is the average levels of earnings. So really what we're seeing is low-income workers earning quite a bit less, but those earnings being quite stable. So you can envision a stylized synopsis of this paper is minimum wage workers really have low income risk because they go back straight to the same minimum wage job that they were working at before they lost their job.
So here I'm gonna propose that this method could be improved, at least potentially in terms of efficiency, if we were to incorporate as additional information the second measurement equation, that is to bring in also the fact that changes in consumption are informative as well about the permanent component, right? So why is this important? So incorporating consumption is important for two reasons, because not only the authors could then understand the evolution of the risk, but they could understand as well the evolution of the transmission of the shocks.
The question that we ask in this project is, how important is legislation and regulation in expanding access to public accommodations? It's a major focus of groups that are marginalized today. And we study the economics of segregation in public accommodations using a historical tool that assisted African Americans in navigating this environment. The Green Books were travel guides that were published by Victor Green between 1936 and 1966. It included information on hotels, informal accommodations, restaurants, and other services that travelers in particular would access. So overall, what we're able to show is that constructing this new national data set of non-discriminatory firms, we can describe the evolution of access to non-discriminatory public accommodations across the United States before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And we see that we're looking for consumer discrimination playing a very large role here, and we do. It is necessary that we have a 1964 Civil Rights Act which bans discrimination in public accommodations, because the market forces were not going to make that so in terms of nationalizing or establishing a practice of non-discrimination nationwide. Our results point to the fact that you would need several world wars worth of casualties or changes to the white consumer distribution to have non-discrimination in public accommodations nationwide. And it suggests that these market conditions, while they were present, are simply insufficient to drastically increase access to non-discrimination and public accommodations nationwide.
I also wanted to ask a question. I thought that the point that you were able to make in your paper looking at market share or market power of the various establishments was really unique, and that might have some perspective on current events and issues going further. So could you kind of reiterate the results that you found on the role of market power and what sort of role these companies might play in these situations?
If you go back through the notes and we looked at for the American Economic Association, they curiously avoided southern cities for many, 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 many years, particularly during this time in which the southern cities would have had discriminatory hotel practices. And they asked this question of why, the Supreme Court asked, why is it that all of these hotels are just leaving all of this money on the table? And when you think about a downtown establishment, a downtown and downtown hotels, there are multiple hotels. And none of them wanted to be the first mover to provide non-discriminatory services, because then all the other hotels that would continue to discriminate would, they believed, earn more money. And so they're making a calculation of how much money they're going to gain, for example, by booking national conventions, as opposed to how much money they're going to lose by not booking weddings and the other sorts of things that hotels are doing for their consumer base. And so this led us to think about the fact that, well, if you're in a smaller town, you might be the only hotel in town. And if you are, then you might be more likely to see nothing but an upside, right, from serving African-American customers, because your white customers have nowhere to go. And that's what gave us this idea that, firms actually were able to use their monopoly power to now, in the evidence of these population shifts, begin to provide non-discriminatory services because they were less afraid of the competitive motives of the other firms in the market continuing to practice discrimination and receiving a lot of customers as a result of that.
So the big question that we're after in this paper, and sort of as being the running theme of this conference, is trying to understand what impacts lending, in particular this lending to minorities, how can we potentially avoid certain types of discrimination? And here we're taking a slightly different approach. We're trying to understand whether the supervisory enforcement mechanism that we have in prudential regulation of financial institutions might play a role in changing the way that banks lend, in particular, whether the enforcement mechanism by itself might change the actual distribution of borrowers and the borrower base that banks lend to. The first column summarizes the main characteristics of denials, and you see that minority borrowers in our sample, on average, are 11% more likely to be rejected a mortgage application than a white borrower. However, following their successful exit from the enforcement action, banks actually reduced this by about 6.4%. So minorities are less likely to be rejected for a loan application. But where is this result coming from? Well, it's coming from a decrease in denial rates for refinancing, mostly, as well as home improvement and non-owner-occupied purchases, so investment properties. So these are known borrowers to banks. 1.8% of it still comes from mortgages that are for owner-occupied properties. So there is some improvement in lending to minorities. What we find is that most of our findings are driven by stricter regulators and banks subject to enforcement actions that take longer, not by their capital management. So it's not that they manage capital, they are trying to appeal to their regulators.
But I think that there is another hypothesis, is that maybe given that there is no enforcement for CRA and other equal lending statutes, then every bank in the sample regularly discriminate. And banking regulators don't punish them for this reason. But once you are caught doing something else, you don't want to further deteriorate your position by being caught discriminating. And so you start to behave a little bit better. Now, you may say, okay, you're nitpicking, because what is the difference from their catering hypothesis to my regulator sleep hypothesis? And in fact, there is one big difference, is the efficiency and the implications of the results. If you are in a world in which before the EDO event, you are under-lending to minorities, you should have a much better performance in terms of default before, and that is reduced afterward. If you are catering to the regulator, you should have a equal performance before that gets worse afterward. And I think that that's something important to find out.